talk. It's called Lessons in Ethical Development I Learned from Star Wars. It was talking at the Code Days, which is a conference that we had here in Buffalo in the fall, and they asked me to come do it here, and I was happy to. So I'm pretty excited. Like I said, my first slide is my bio. My name is Jameson Hampton. I go by Jamie primarily. You can find me on Twitter at JamieBash. I'm a software engineer. I work for a company called Agrilyst. I'm primarily a Rails developer, but we're an ag tech startup in New York City. I work remotely from here, and we do farm management and data analysis for indoor farms and greenhouses, so it's pretty interesting. And I'm also a panelist on Greater Than Code, which is a tech podcast. The premise of it is kind of like, people wrote your code, so why don't you learn about the people as well as the code, which we think is really important. But as you may have figured out from my title, I'm mainly here to talk about Star Wars. I really love Star Wars, so now you know all the facts you ever possibly need to know about me. This is kind of a joke a little bit, but it didn't used to be because I've been giving this talk for a while. It has Rogue One spoilers. It has Star Wars Rebels spoilers. It's one of the cartoons. I'm really Star Wars trash, which is what you're gonna see. And then at the end, I talk about The Last Jedi too. I gave this talk for the first time like 2 weeks after The Last Jedi came out, and like a dozen people like got up and left, and I was like, I respect that. So yeah, morality has been like a really hot ticket item in the tech industry lately. Probably under other industries too. If you work in tech, or if you've ever used the website twitter.com, you're probably already aware of this. This is a question from last year, actually, the Stack Overflow developer survey last year. And they asked, do you believe that you have an obligation to consider the ethical implications of the code that you write? And I got kind of confused about this question and its inclusion on like a survey, because it seemed like there was just like an objectively right answer that seemed really obvious to me. But it turns out that nothing is really obvious. This is a tweet from Pablo Hidalgo. He's one of the Star Wars writers, and he said, every time you think something is obvious, it's helpful to remember that this is the Twitter that needs reminders that the Empire were the bad guys in Star Wars. So I kind of walked right into that one. But I guess it's kind of true. Maybe it's not actually obvious, because every time I look at the news or at current events, I see stuff like this. Researchers building AI to identify game members. This is some of the type of tech I'm going to continue to talk about several more times in this presentation. But one of their computer scientists says, I'm just an engineer. And this idea that people have that being just an engineer absolves them from any responsibility on what they're working on is really real. And it's also really dangerous. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. But let's talk about it in the context of Star Wars, because I think that's a little bit more fun and maybe a little bit less scary. I really love Rogue One. It's really kind of special to me. I was very excited when the trailers came out. I saw this group of people, these rebels, a group from marginalized backgrounds, and like they're going out there, they're fighting the man, they're fighting the Empire, they're just like me. I'm going to go to this movie and I'm going to relate to them, and it's going to be like amazing. And that's not what happened. I went to see Rogue One on opening night, and the character that I really related to in it was this character, Orson Krennic, who, if you aren't familiar with Star Wars, you can tell that he's a bad guy because he's wearing a white cape. And so we came home from seeing Rogue One with my partner Isaiah, who's here, and he was like, how did you like the movie? And I was like, oh my god, what am I doing with my career? And he was like, really? This is what you want to talk about? And it is what I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk about how I kind of came to this realization. And to get there, I think if we're going to talk about morality, like maybe we should talk about good and evil. And Star Wars is like a really classic story of good and evil. And when you first look at it, you know, maybe there's not a lot of room for middle ground there. If you've never seen Star Wars, again, you can look at this picture and like it's very obvious who the good guys are and who the bad guys are without knowing anything about it. And so when I look at Star Wars or a story like this, it makes me feel like, okay, well, I'm not a bad guy, so I'm not going to do any bad stuff. No worries. But maybe it's somewhere along the line I started to realize it wasn't so simple. This tweet storm actually like totally changed my life. This is from November 2016, right after the election. And Kate Crawford's amazing, you should read all of her stuff. And so she says, we need to talk about ethics more because developers will be asked to do some seriously awful things in the next 4 years. The tech industry is already building tools for predictive policing, criminal justice risk scores, and tracking refugees. Will you build the Muslim registry or work on locating undocumented workers or deploy facial recognition to identify protesters? The technical community has a responsibility to say what they stand for and what they won't stand for. And this really, really, really got me thinking about how not everything we do is completely unambiguous in that way. Good people do bad things. They could do them and they do. Maybe for misguided reasons, maybe because they don't realize what they're doing. And then I realized that even in Star Wars, maybe it's not so unambiguous as it first seemed like. Because this guy right here, spoiler alert, is actually Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker is a Jedi and a war hero. And in fact, in almost all of the villains in Star Wars were originally heroes and like accidentally became villains due to the temptation of the dark side. They were tricked by the dark side because it turns out people are pretty easy to trick. Count Dooku was also a Jedi. Kylo Ren was kind of primed for being a good guy too. We know who his parents are, and this is how it turned out. And it's not even just like, okay, you know, you're a Jedi, you're a good guy, so now you don't have to worry. Even the good guys that stay good guys in Star Wars all face temptation. Luke Skywalker is offered this opportunity to lead the galaxy next to his father, pretty tempting. Rey had just found out that she had Jedi powers when this person was like, come, like, you're so powerful, let me teach you, let me help you unlock your potential. Like, that would have been pretty tempting for me. I have like a lot of Star Wars trash references in here, I'm sorry. Obi-Wan, it had this whole thing with Duchess Satine on Mandalore, Ezra Bridger from Rebels, found out all this information by tapping into the dark side that he needed. Even Master Yoda faced temptation, and if Master Yoda has to deal with it, that means we all have to deal with it. So, Star Wars Catalyst is the prequel novel to Rogue One, which I read before it came out. I promise, I'm just like, I have a Star Wars problem. But it kind of put me in this mindset that I was in when I saw the movie. It was about these two characters who you'll recognize if you saw Rogue One. This is, again, Orson Krennic. He was the director of the Advanced Weapons Research Program. And then this is Galen Erso. He was the lead engineer on the Death Star project. And this kind of goes into their whole backstory. They knew each other from when they were in college. They go way back. Galen was a known pacifist. He refused to work for the government in any situation. But Krennic knew that he was going to need him for this project because he was like the authority on crystallography, which is like kyber crystals that make lightsabers work. And so he groomed him for many years. He kind of knew his hopes and dreams. He knew that Galen wanted to work on renewable energy for outer rim planets. And so he had all these promises about that. He manipulated him, told him stories about the Clone Wars, horror stories, saying that he could help end this with his research. And so he started working on a project called Project Celestial Power, which eventually ended up being the Death Star project. But he worked on it for years before he realized how they were implementing it. And this is a quote from the book. This is his mentor, Galen's mentor, trying to convince him to come work with her. The war has altered everything, not only for those of us directly involved in the conflict, but also for many of us here on Coruscant. Count Dooku shook us awake to a harsh reality, and most of us have traded theory for practicality. Unlimited funding has been wonderful for research. In due time, we'll return to our dream, providing renewable energy, and we'll be able to accomplish much more than we ever could before. So I read this, and I was like, oh, well, this sounds great. Like, who wouldn't want this job? I was almost getting frustrated with him for not wanting to take this job. And then I was like, shit, like, this is the Death Star project. I even knew that because I know what the story is about before I went into it. And so that's kind of how I would have been tricked into working on the Death Star project if I lived in that universe, even though I already knew, because people are easy to trick. And so that really got me thinking, like, oh my God, I've never thought about this. You know, I had never thought about what I would do if I was in a situation asked to do something like this. I never assigned a sense of morality to my work. And if you think of your work as amoral, like not immoral, but just amoral, it's kind of dangerous, because then you might not realize when you're at the point where you're like treading into dangerous water. And so it got me thinking about implementing self-accountability. I have some thoughts about it. I think the moment that you're faced with an ethical dilemma is not a good time to start thinking about where you want to put that line. That makes it way too easy to be like, yeah, sure, this is a good opportunity. It sounds good, why not? If you think about these things before they happen to you, then you're kind of prepared on how to react in that moment. I don't think you should feel obligated to make big decisions immediately. I think that that's good advice on pretty much everything in life. It's okay to take time to think about big decisions. I also think if there's people that don't want to give you that time to consider, I would maybe not trust those people. I also find it really helpful to write things down. When you're thinking about your moral code, take notes on your thoughts. If I'm faced with a decision suddenly and I wasn't expecting it, I'm probably not deep in thought about ethics right at that exact moment. So I find it really helpful to be able to look back on my thoughts from a time when I was deep in thought about it. Ultimately, holding yourself accountable means not doing bad stuff, and that means not even as a joke. I made this a couple of years ago now, and I posted on the internet. I thought it was really funny. I still do, actually. That's not my information, because I'm not an idiot. But I ended up taking it down because I thought about it a little harder, and I realized that, like, if even one person fell for it and posted their information and then their identity got stolen, that would kind of be on me in a way. So I took down my joke meme, but I still have my slides, so I'm not that good of a person. If you're thinking about like, okay, well, how do I approach this kind of decision making? Michael Davis is from the Illinois Institute of Technology. He's a philosophy professor, and he has this 7-step process for ethical decisions that I find really, really interesting and helpful. Number 1, state the problem. This could be something like, I don't know, doing this just makes me feel kind of uncomfortable, or I'm worried about how my work could be misused, and I think it's a problem. Number 2, check the facts. Some problems disappear once you look at all the facts, but other problems get bigger. Identify relevant factors. This could be other people involved, it could be laws, it could be professional codes that you adhere to, or practical constraints about what you're doing. Develop a list of options, and then test the options. And he has several different ways, suggestions of what kind of tests you can do that I really like. The colleague test. How would my colleagues feel if they found out that this is how I decided to go about this? The harm test. Does this cause less harm than possible alternatives? The publicity test. Would I want my choice about this published in a newspaper? The defensibility test. Could I defend my choice in front of a committee if it came down to that? And the reversibility test I really like. Would I still think that this was a good choice if it ended up affecting me negatively in the future? So at this point, you kind of have to make the decision based on all the thinking you've done about it. But then the last step is reviewing your choice. How do I feel about it after the fact? How can I prevent another choice from having to be made like this in the future, possibly? This is a tweet from my friend Brenna that I think about a lot. The question should always be, should we build the thing, not can we build the thing? I believe that we can build mostly anything. But knowing how something fits in our society and how it impacts all of us requires more nuance. I totally agree with this. I think as developers, we have a tendency to get very caught up in this idea of, can we do it? Can we figure it out? It's an interesting problem. It's a puzzle that I want to solve. And I totally get that. I mean, that's what I like about coding too. I want to solve puzzles. I understand this desire to get caught up in like what is ultimately the fun part about coding. But the time to realize that the thing you just made is horrible is not after you've already made it. That's a horrible situation to be in, and it's a situation that a lot of people have been in, because this is really real, not just in fiction. This slide is called "Woe is Me." "Woe is me" is a quote from Einstein that he said after he heard about the bombing of Hiroshima. Einstein didn't personally work on the atomic bomb project, but his discoveries were used for it, and he was actively supportive of that at the time. But later he said, "Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in producing an atomic bomb, I never would have lifted a finger." Nonfiction is a lot more depressing to talk about, so that's why we're kind of primarily talking about Star Wars, but I think it's really important to think about like real life people who have this kind of feeling of guilt about their work and their inventions. Mikhail Kalashnikov invented the AK-47 and then felt responsibility for the people who died at the hands of it. Later on his deathbed, he said that he wished that he had spent his life developing technology for farmers instead of for war. Cameron Loebman invented pepper spray that was intended to be used as a weapon, but after seeing how it was used in practice, he regretted it. He said, "I've never seen such an inappropriate and improper use of chemical agents." And I've had a lot of very kind of depressing life or death scenarios, but that's not all it is. Robert Probst invented the cubicle. He thought that it would be better than offices. It would be like a more flexible environment for workers. But then companies started using it as like a cost-saving measure and like packing more and more people in. He didn't like that. I love his quote about it. "The cubicalizing of people in modern corporations is monolithic insanity." But kind of the takeaway here from all of these stories is that you can't control how other people are going to use your work. Once you put it out in the world, it's out in the world, and people are going to do what they do with it. This is particularly true of code, even more so, because code doesn't know what it's being used for. Only the people using it understand what it's being used for, because we're smarter than our code. I know that some days it doesn't feel like it, but I promise we are. So once you decide that something's important to you, you have to kind of think about what other technologies are similar enough that your code could be repurposed and used for them. The example I like to use is facial recognition for identifying protesters is one of the examples that Crawford talked about. So maybe you've looked at this, you're like, no, I'm against that, I'm drawing my line, don't want to work on that, I think it's unethical. Well, if you feel really strongly about that, you might want to consider that working in video games and doing facial recognition for like ARGs, for example, might also be something that you want to take off the table. This is a picture from the Hunger Games ARG, which used facial recognition to identify like players. But that kind of technology could be so easily used for something else, it's kind of scary. I do want to note that this is kind of based on how important something is to you in particular. I've had people come up to me after I gave this talk and tell me that they didn't think this was a good example because they didn't think it was reasonable to, put video games off the table for this reason. I personally disagree with that, but if you've considered the implications and you've decided what's important to you and it's not important to you enough to turn down, like I'm not here to change your mind and tell you this is what you have to think, this is where your line has to be. But I do think it's really dangerous to go in not thinking about it. I think that you should think about it before and then make an informed decision on what you've decided to get into. Incidentally, this is exactly what happened to Galen Erso and Catalyst. If he had known what they were going to use this research for, he would not have signed on. This is an example of someone trying to prevent this. Lerna is an open source software management program. In the fall, they implemented a change in their license to prevent it from being used by companies that have contracted with ICE in the past. There was all these allegations of human rights abuses with ICE, and they were like, no, we're against that. They added it in their license, and they listed several high-profile companies specifically, including Microsoft and Amazon. This caused divisiveness in the community. This is a critic of it. Posted this. that the Learner Project's choice is destructive of one of the deep social norms that keeps the open source community functional, keeping politics separated from our work. Ultimately, literally one day later, they reversed the decision and put the license back the way it was originally. I don't really think it's helpful to spend time debating the validity of this particular decision. I do think it's interesting that the folks at Learner were at least thinking about this. And I do think that this idea of keeping politics separated from our work is very scary to me because it's not really possible. Politics are intertwined with our work. Our politics is really how we feel about things, and how we feel about things is intertwined with everything we do. So we can either acknowledge that there is politics in our work, and we can be smart about that, or we can live in denial and pretend like there's not, and then we'll be unable to implement any real accountability. So this is the problem I think that arises when you think of your work as secular and you can't have accountability in it. I love this quote: any sufficiently advanced neglect is indistinguishable from malice. If you create a city out of straw, it doesn't take an entire army of malicious people to destroy your city. One malicious person can walk in and burn down your city. And InfoSec works the same way. If you create a system that's compromised or compromisable, that's kind of like building a city out of straw. Because one person can exploit it, and once it's exploited, it's too late. It's already been exploited. Organizations can kind of be like this too. If you have 99 people at your company that just aren't thinking about whether something is ethical or not because it's not on their mind, then you have this danger that one person, a person like Orson Krennic, could walk in and convince them to build something unethical. And they might go along with that because it's secular from morality. There's no accountability in place. Algorithmic bias is an example of a huge problem in the tech industry that I think is caused more by carelessness than malevolence. At least that is what I would like to think. What do I mean by algorithmic bias? Sometimes that means you have a feature that you think is going to be cute or convenient for the majority of your users. But then there's edge cases that you didn't think of, and it can be hurtful. This is an example. Facebook was doing these little cute graphics on top of your most loved photo. And this person's most loved photo was when he posted when his mom died. And so Facebook served that back up to him with cute little animations on it, and that was like a hurtful experience. This is from Twitter. Twitter decided it would be convenient for its users if instead of asking you for your gender or not needing it, because I'm not really sure why you need it, they would just guess what your gender is based on your posts and like assign that to your account. They probably thought that that would be more convenient for people because they wouldn't have to like go in and do it. But particularly in the trans community, it was really hurtful for people who had to go in and be like, well, Twitter misgendered me just like everybody else in my life. Sometimes it's even much more serious than this. The Compass algorithm measures predicted recidivism for folks convicted of crimes. So they would predict the likelihood of someone to go on and commit future crimes. Only about 60% of the people that it predicted would go on to commit future crimes actually did, so 40% didn't. And black defendants were twice as likely to be false flagged as high risk, and white defendants were twice as likely to be false flagged as low risk. This is according to an investigation by ProPublica. Why is this? Well, it's partially because of the questions they asked. Things like, has anyone in your family or your neighborhood or your social circle been arrested? Black folks are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white people, often because of racial profiling. So they're much more likely to be considered a risk by this algorithm, even if they've never done anything wrong. And it's just kind of snowballing that racial profiling effect. And this algorithm, which by the way is secret because it's proprietary, so I don't actually even know how it works, is used in court, and it affects what kind of sentencing people will get. So it's ruining people's lives. I could give an entire talk on algorithmic bias, but I won't because this is not all I want to talk about. So, but I do recommend these 2 books, Technically Wrong and Weapons of Math Destruction, 2 of my favorite books. These examples are from Technically Wrong. So we've been talking a lot about people who kind of lack a moral code. And hopefully we've established that like that person's not you. You want to do good if you can. You care about the people that your algorithms could affect. But what if that person is your boss? That's kind of what I mean here by you have to know who the general is. Where are those orders coming from? Is that person acting in good faith? Do you know if they are or not? So again, I turn to Star Wars for answers. There's no more morally corrupt employer than the Empire, and the Empire employed billions of people. So if you're in one of those situations, you've got to think about what you're going to do. You have options. You could sell out, you could quit. We know how Galen Erso ended up dealing with his guilt over being part of the Death Star project. But not all, we don't have to be talking about so obviously sabotage. I want to talk about another person who worked for the Empire, Agent Kallus from Star Wars Rebels. He's not like Galen Erso. Kallus was an Imperial poster boy. He really kind of seemed to believe what the Empire was selling. He rose up through the ranks. But he had this really interesting redemption arc in the show that I kind of want to talk about briefly. So this is Zeb Aurelius that he's with. He was one of the rebels from Star Wars Rebels, and they have this strange history. They fought on opposite sides in the war. And they get stranded on an ice moon together. They have to work together to survive. They start to respect each other, like, et cetera, et cetera. I'm actually usually not crazy about that kind of story. I find that it puts a lot of pressure on marginalized people to like find common ground with their oppressors. It's probably a rant for a different day. But I kind of liked this one because of the way they did it. Kallus basically went all like, not all Imperials, and Zeb didn't lose his cool about it, but it wasn't because he felt like he owed him civility. He was just like, this isn't worth it to me. I'm confident in my decisions. He kind of planted the seeds of doubt about the Empire. He accused him of not asking questions because he didn't want to know the answers. That obviously got to him. He had a sense of trust in his friends from the rebellion that Kallus didn't have with the other people from the Empire, so that got to him. At the end, he has a tearful reunion with his friends, and then Kallus has to like find his way back alone, and like nobody cared that he was gone or like noticed that he was gone. And so something about this experience got through to him. He defected from the Empire, and he became Agent Fulcrum, which was like the code name for a defector that's like feeding secrets to the rebellion about what the Empire's doing. And I thought it was interesting that arc was so different because it got me really thinking about where you can do the most good and like different ways to kind of fight back against systems that you're not feeling okay about. You could just quit. Our argument I always see about quitting is like, well, it doesn't matter because they'll just replace you. Someone's going to do it and get paid for it, so it might as well be you. I don't really agree with that, even if it's just so, I can sleep well at night, like feeling good about what I'm doing with my life. But also, I don't think it's as simple as that either. If you're specialized enough, you might be irreplaceable. This is kind of what happened with Galen Erso. He quit and he was irreplaceable. And the Death Star project shut down. And that's why at Rogue One they came and forced him to come back. But even if not, your efforts could just be better used elsewhere. Wedge Antilles is a pilot from the original trilogy. He worked for the Empire as a pilot originally. So he quit. His absence didn't hurt the Empire because they just got another pilot. But then he became a pilot for the Rebellion, and that did hurt the Empire actively. Also, when we're talking about sabotage, rebellion from the inside doesn't have to be Death Star level sabotage. I'm not here to try to convince you to go into work tomorrow and literally blow up whatever you've been working on. If you're working on a literal planet destroyer, it might be a good idea. But if you're not, maybe not. But maybe you could convince them to change practices. Maybe not everything as unambiguous as the Empire. If you're in one of those neglect versus malice situations, you might be able to say, hey, did you ever think about this? Maybe we could do better. Whistleblowing is also very important. That's essentially what Kallus was doing as Agent Fulcrum. He wasn't actively messing up the Empire's plans. He wasn't doing active sabotage, but he passed on information about it, and that, helped this other faction. Fighting the good fight can be really overwhelming. I get it. Some people get really stuck up on that someone's going to do it, might as well be me thing. And when people are scared, they may feel safer to just succumb to pressure to do things that they don't feel comfortable with. This is especially true for marginalized people. There's a huge pressure on us to be one of the good ones and kind of like suck up. And I kind of get it. Like, there's definitely something attractive about like getting in with people that might oppress you so that like you're safe. I also know that real life can be messier than I'm making it out to be here. I definitely don't want to like particularly guilt trip minorities into like putting themselves in danger or quitting their job because if they don't have that luxury. But some of us do have that luxury, and I think it's an important thing to at least consider that an unethical organization like the Empire only cares about you for as long as you're useful to it. You know, not only is it unethical for you to put yourself in a position where you're kind of saving yourself over others, but it also doesn't make anyone suddenly care about you as a person if they weren't gonna. You see this over and over and over in Star Wars. The gulf of what it's like to be part of the rebellion versus what it's like to be part of the Empire is pretty well explored. Rebels is a great example because it's about a family. Everyone really cares about each other really genuinely. And time after time, in every iteration of Star Wars, I cannot help but marvel over how awful it seems to be part of the Empire. Nobody has meaningful relationships with each other. Everyone's rooting for everyone else around them to fail so that they can seize power. It's just hyper-competitive all the time. And even if you get to the point where high ranking, it doesn't get better. It doesn't make anyone care about you. In fact, it just makes more people want you to fail. Arsene Krennic is a really prime example of this. I keep coming back to him because I really relate to Krennic in a lot of meaningful ways. He's very ambitious, he loves networking, he's really good at it, he knows a lot of people, he knows how to make connections between them. These are all things that like I kind of pride myself on in the tech industry. So I see a lot of myself in him, and it's kind of scary because he's a horrible person. But I think it's important to be able to admit when you can relate to like the villains, because then you it kind of shows you what about yourself you need to be careful about. He spent his whole life working hard to gain favor within the Empire and move up. He even succeeded at building a Death Star for them in the end. But then they just took what he built and they let him be destroyed. They didn't care about him at all. He spent his whole life being the villain, and what did he have to show for it at the end? Like, absolutely nothing. In The Last Jedi, gray morals get even grayer. What really is the dark side? What really is the light side? I'm starting to question if it even makes sense to really separate them in that way, in that unambiguous way. I think that's what Luke was getting at when he was trying to teach Rey about the Force. And Benicio del Toro's new character, DJ, gets the exact same thing, and he kind of has a point. You know, good guys, bad guys, it's all kind of messier than that. It's easy to look at things as if they're really unambiguous, but I don't necessarily think it's helpful. But actually my big moral lesson of The Last Jedi came from Poe Dameron. I really love this. It came out like right before the movie, and it said, "Can Poe get along with his new boss?" And then I saw the movie and I was like, nope. He's like a really legitimately good guy, but he messed up really bad, even though he had best interests at heart. And I think about that a lot because the fact is, you can truly believe that you're doing the right thing, and you can still screw it up, especially if you don't have all of the information about it. And that's totally what happened with Poe and Admiral Holdo. And it's kind of what happened with Galen Erso too, to be honest. So I got 3 lessons takeaway from The Last Jedi versus the lesson from Poe. You gotta get as much information as you can before going in and making a rash decision. But also from Holdo. If you're in a position of power, consider transparency. You know, Poe made mistakes in The Last Jedi, but if she had been more open about their plan, she also could have been in a position to prevent those mistakes from happening. And a surprise lesson from Yoda, who said, "The greatest teacher failure is." Maybe despite your best efforts, you're still gonna mess it up. It happens. You have to make peace with that. You have to decide you're gonna do better next time and move on with your life. So what's my conclusion? I don't really have all the answers. There's not a single line that I want to point out and say, this is the line that nobody should cross. I think we all have to decide what's important to us personally and determine where our personal line is. I can only urge you to make a conscious decision about that and then commit to sticking to your own principles. My hope is that if we all do that, then we won't end up building another Death Star. Thank you.
Questions?
My water bottle up here and it was a mistake.
Do you have one?
I do have one. Well, thank you so much. I really love talking about Star Wars because I love Star Wars. I really love talking about ethics because I think it's really important. So, thanks.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, what was Galen's daughter's name again? Jin, right?
Yes.
Jin or so. Okay, so I know she didn't talk about her arc, but I think her arc is really interesting because it comes from the position of having no power and having everything taken from you. So, like, I guess my question is, how do you feel about being someone who is marginalized and how much effort you can put forth to efforts like this, educating people and, you know, changing the way that people in tech are conscious about ethics?
That's a great question. I think you gotta do what you can, and like you gotta accept that like if you're doing what you can, that's what you can. You know, it's really hard. I was just talking about this today actually. Like this idea, this like really difficult line that marginalized people have to walk, where it's like, you know, a lot of people want to say, and I agree with this, like, you know, it's not people of color's responsibility to end racism because they didn't start it, and it's not, you know, trans people's job to end transphobia because they didn't start it. And, like, I agree with that. Like, it should be the majority of people that are like propagating this. It's like their problem to solve. But like, if I don't do anything, like, who's gonna do it? And so I get really like torn up, and I'm like, you know, this isn't my job, but like I'm doing it anyway because I think it's important. But I don't want other people to feel like because I'm doing it, they have to do it. And like, there's a lot of complications with that. I think that like a good thing that everyone can do is like not put evil into the world. And that's kind of like what I really wanted to get into with this talk. And then like if you're not putting evil in the world and you feel like you can like do another step and like actively put good in the world, that's like great. But that's, I guess, not what I want to put pressure on people to do necessarily. If we all just stopped doing evil, we wouldn't have to do that. That's how I feel about it.
So the Twitter example appalled me. The fact that like they did that. I'm so sorry. Like that's awful. Like, and I didn't even know that Twitter did that. So like I'm really upset by that. Like it's really sticking with me. In terms of like data collection that companies do, because they all do it, right? With cookies and things like that. Where do you think the line should be in a perfect world? Right?
Again, I don't have like a really specific answer to that, but when I think about, like, when I'm doing data collection, you know, for like companies that I work for and our users and stuff, what I really try to think about is like, why are we asking for this information? Like, do we need to know people's gender? Like, is there any reason that that's going to be useful to us in a way that's actually serving them? You know what I mean? And like, if not, why are we collecting it? And I think that, like, it's really hard because like on Twitter, I don't think there's a reason. And like, there are other situations where like maybe there is a reason. And so it's not like a one-size-fits-all answer, but I wish that people would think harder about that rather than just being like, these are the 7 things that everyone asked for.
Yeah.
So.
Can I make a devil's advocate guess for Twitter's reasoning? Most people are standard genders, right? And they're trying to advertise, and the most money is to the most easy targets. So they're trying to know whether your Twitter feed should have an ad for clothing or for car tires, and that's why they do it.
But isn't like, okay, I'm a business owner, so I'll argue back, like,
Yeah.
so essentially you're creating profiles of various customers, right? How is that different from stereotyping in like a negative sense?
It's not different. I'm not saying that businesses are good ethically. I'm saying that's their reason. That's the reason for doing it, is it makes it easier.
If there's a pattern
them,
that makes
for them.
more money, then
Yeah.
it doesn't, well,
'Cause
again,
we don't
I
pay-
completely disagree with this, but.
Right, but we don't
But-
pay to use Twitter.
Right.
Yeah, somebody's
Where's your
servers
information?
cost an electricity, so.
Sure. If I can chime in, the devil has enough advocates. So we all know what advertising is.
Yep.
So if you want to talk about advertising, and your question was a perfect world, so we can talk about that. Advertising in the history of advertising has dramatically changed to the point where from generic books of things you'd have to look at for tons of advertisement, now only give you a few in the side of the website you're scrolling, right? Or, you run into one every like 100 posts you're scrolling. So these advertisements are more targeted, and so because of that, they're trying to get more data. So what they're trying to do is edge out each other with a whole new industry. So what advertising has done is become its own industry itself. So now there's companies that do advertising that hire other companies that do advertising because they want to figure out the best way to do everything, and there's just tons of excess money that is wasted spent on trying to figure out the best way to advertise to you. And a lot of that has to do with very silly stereotypes about what people want and what people want to buy. And what we see with women over and over again is that they say, these commercials are totally bullshit. And they want something else, and they want to change. So I think all around we can say, we want our advertisements to change and become, I wouldn't mind if they were just bland. Here's the product, here's the facts about it, here you go. But we don't live in that world. So I guess your question was a perfect world, and you said, well, we're not in one. But I think this talk really shows that we ought to be asking that question over and over, even if we know that we live in whatever real world is.
I'll throw it out that there have, actually since you gave your talk at Code Days, at least two major things have happened. GDPR, at least in Europe, forces people to ask exactly that question. And the ACM also published, for the first time ever, a code of ethics for software developers.
Do you think it's far enough though?
No.
See, that's the issue.
ACM already had.
It had,
I think it had one.
I don't think it had a code of, at least not as comprehensive a code of ethics as they, because it was a big deal that
Yeah, I remember
they were
reading
making a
that.
really big deal about it.
Okay, yeah, I saw it. I think last year.
Okay.
At RIT, they force you to take. Force you at gunpoint. No. So they make you take a professional communications class, and there is a whole about a month dedicated to just talk about moral dilemmas. So one of the things is being asked to push code that isn't tested fully, or has a bug. The best example in tech would be the O-ring for the was it the Challenger, right?
Yeah, throttle up challenge.
Where someone knew about it, but someone went, forget about it, and they tried to go to that person's boss, and then they tried to go to the media, right? And they tried to do all these different things, and it didn't work out. And we talked about all the potential options you have in a case where you're asked to do something negative. So one of the things you can do is do nothing, which is the worst case. You can walk away. That's probably not as great either because you're just avoiding personal culpability. You can talk to your boss. You can talk to your boss's boss. You can talk to the media. But at the end of the day, if you're forced to take action that can be seen as illegal in the eyes of the court, but is right, that is a question that no one has the answer to.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think like one of the people have asked me too, like, well, what's the solution to this? And I'm like, obviously I don't have like a solution to everything, but I think that the first step is like, why aren't all computer science students required to take ethics classes? I was not a computer science major. I was an art major, and guess what? I was required to take ethics classes for art, and like computer science people should be taking ethics classes. Like it's such a no-brainer to me, and everyone should take one, and everyone should have to think about it, and like, you know, that's not gonna solve all the problems, but it's gonna get that thought into people's minds, and like hopefully it's gonna stick there for people. And so that's my thought on it.
So, sorry, who wants to go?
I was just gonna say, so in the wake of that Facebook scandal from a couple weeks ago, where they were caught putting out the app that basically collected all data on phone, one of the things you saw was, you know, conversations from Facebook employees about this whole thing, and some of them had some concerns, but there were other ones who just straight up said, "No, I'm in this for the money. I don't care." So like, that's part of the problem, is how do you deal with these willfully unethical people? I don't have a great answer to that.
I guess my answer would be just like, make that such a like socially unacceptable thing to say, and like that's what we are essentially trying to do with like lots of problems. Like, you know, how do you solve like bigotry? Like, make it completely socially unacceptable to be like, you know, you're just like, nobody wants to associate with someone who's a bigot. Like, obviously that's not where we are, but like that's the idea, and I think like that's the only thing I can think of as an answer to that.
I think like civil engineers have to get a license, right, to build, and you know, I think it's by state. But no one really asked, should we have that for software engineers? And I think if, you know, you're working for a mega corp and you have access to, you know, machinery that you can hurt people, I think people should have to get a license in order to do that. And if they get it taken away, they can't earn money.
Like a medical license. Like, it's been revoked. I did get security clearance to work when I worked at a bank to do work in their code, because I would have access to people's information, and like that seemed reasonable to me.
What is the line of data that doesn't need security clearance? Because I work in like accounting and like financial stuff all the time, and like, I mean, maybe 7 steps most you can view anonymized data, right? So like, I don't know, what's the line? I don't know where the line is, but.
Is it possible to anonymize data? I thought some of your better students were proving you can't.
We'll de-anonymize it, like.
Even that, they're showing that you can functionally unanonymize data.
Yeah, that's
So
insane.
there are ways to essentially anonymize data in a way that you can actually prove that you can't reliably recover any one or any fixed number of records from the input. Of course, those kind of destroy most of the statistical properties about the data, so they end up being difficult to use in practice. People are working on that. But just kind of stripping out identifiers, you probably still want some security on that. Yeah.
Oh, I got a couple of things to say. I think about this philosophy stuff a lot. And just to backtrack, Bill Hicks is one of my favorite comedians, so I hate advertising. So, but one of the problems that I've noticed with all of this is everybody thinks they're doing the right thing. Even where you can see that that person's ethically challenged, he doesn't see it. You know, your Death Star example, Darth Vader says to Luke Skywalker, "We can restore order to the galaxy." What a noble cause, right? you know? And like, to me, one of the references I like to have in my head about the Force in Star Wars is, okay, you've got it's kind of like in that number theory for computer science where you got countably infinite and uncountably infinite. The number of lies you can make up are uncountably infinite, but the number of truths are very, very finite, you know? And the dark side to me is that uncountably infinite, you know, and having order is a wonderful thing. There's so many good things we do with order, like we feed people all over the world because we have order instead of chaos, you know, but there's always this crazy crossover where trying to maintain order also crushes people in the process, you know, and it's so hard to find any kind of hard and fast rules. It's like you took the border out of the yin and yang and it all turned to gray, you know. But I do know that people who you think are ethically wrong can be reached, and like you said, the most important thing is that they start to realize this is unacceptable behavior. And if they don't know, they don't know. You know, you get cultured in a way that you think you're always doing the right thing, because that's how you came up. And until you run into a culture where it's different, then you find out something's wrong. And usually you think the other is wrong, no matter who they are, because I'm always right, aren't I? You know, I'm always doing the right thing. You know, you could be thinking you're doing the right thing for Jesus or for computer science or for science, or you always think you're in the right, you know? And that's a problem.
I definitely think you're right that there are people that are doing things that I would consider, you know, wrong or evil that like think it's right. But I don't think it's right that everyone feels that way. Like, I think there's a lot of people that are just like, I don't care, or like, this isn't important to me, or like people that have that like anxiety, doubt, like deep inside, they're trying to pretend. Like, I think that there's different categories there.
Everybody that I've run into like that, and I've dug deeper in, they think they're doing the right thing. They don't want to admit it to you because they don't know how to argue well enough to win their argument, but they think they're doing the right thing. And when you gently work with them, you can pull that bad thinking out of their culture.
I think people's moral compasses are products of their environment, and I think that we too often separate our environment as a global thing from our local environment. So we try to look at maybe our parents and stuff, when maybe we should think about things like how we view speech, right, and what we define as speech. And I think if you follow the money literally, we consider your money to be speech. We put God on our money. People kill each other over money. Money is a made-up thing. It's a made-up concept. We made it up. It's not a naturally occurring thing. So we humans created this thing. If you want to talk on a big scale, and you want to say, oh, these people, they're just ignorant, right? Or they don't know how to argue, or whatever. I don't think incompetence is a real thing. I think people are a product of a force. So I think from a Marxist perspective, you would say those people who don't realize what they're doing is wrong, don't realize it because they've been brought up and indoctrinated through the system of capital. And a lot of times, the shaky ethics stuff isn't lone wolves. It has a lot of money behind it. So I think that's a thing that a lot of people don't want to talk about too, is the fact that the people asking you to do it may not just be your immediate boss, but it may be the agenda of the shareholders of the company you work for, which is then, in turn, all the investors into the company, right, and the industry itself, because they see big companies do it, all the other little companies will do it. So what happens is a few people, with their money, change the way we view morals. And we can't really do much about that.
Yeah, let's build an economic system based on self-centered, selfish greed, and what could go wrong?
I don't know.
So it might be veering a little off topic, but Larry Niven had a nice essay on the surrender reflex. And I think if you kind of replace surrender reflex with empathy for other people, you get a similar conclusion. So the observation was basically that if you have a wolf facing off against another wolf, they go at each other's throats. Eventually, one of them decides, I'm not going to win, I need to give up because I can't win. And the other one accepts the surrender because, hey, it's a harsh world out there, I need your help. And then you kind of progress up to kind of early tribes where you essentially have similar reflexes. People might butt heads in small groups, but at the end of the day, they realize they have to kind of work together to overcome something. But then this funny thing happens when you kind of scale that up even further. You start seeing people specializing into organizational roles and the people starting to specialize in the actual execution of fighting. And so essentially the people who would surrender, or who would be in a position to surrender because they're at immediate threat, are not really in a position to surrender because they're being told to keep fighting. And it's something you said kind of struck me. You kind of have that same thing with kind of arguably immoral actions. You are being told by your bosses to do this because your bosses say it's the right thing, and their bosses say it's the right thing. But you're the one who's actually doing it. You're the one who actually sees the direct impact of those actions. So kind of you have this distinction between the people in the trenches actually doing the stuff and the people kind of controlling it who just see essentially a pile of numbers. This quarter's revenues went up, yay, versus I just ruined 50 people's lives with this code that I wrote. I don't know how to fix that, like descaling it somehow. Yeah.
I think there's a way to turn it on its head that shakes out a lot of truth. Dr. Michael Parenti says that when you're talking about imperialism, which is what happened to create the largest economic boom the world has ever seen, you have the ordinary people just sending off their sons to die for the cost of empire, and they don't see the money come back. And then the money comes back, and then the people in that country, America, are told, these countries are very poor. These are poor countries, they're super poor. But it's only the people that are poor, because what the US is actually doing is extracting tons of value. So it's the country is rich, but the people are poor by the US's design. And this is a thing that is decided by the government, right? So you have, again, few people, organizational role, like you're talking about, who are deciding this is what's going to happen and we're going to benefit. And then as long as you own the media, or the media says, hey, I'm making a ton of money off of this too, so I don't care, then there's nothing that the ordinary people can do. But I think it changes the way we view other cultures, because suddenly you don't view the cultures as, these third world barbaric nations, right? They're people who, unfortunately, by capital design, are forced to live in that quality by the United States. If they're allowed to industrialize on their own, they can extract their value on their own, support their own system. A lot of times when that happens, the country realizes, hey, if we didn't do this, the U.S. would have destroyed us. Maybe we should think about opposing them globally. And when that happens, the U.S. tries to turn them over with a coup or something. Very depressing. But that's a huge scale moral thing, and I don't think I'm ever going to be, in that room with all those very powerful people making that decision. So, zombie. Michael Prenti's great. You should look him up. He talks about one of the big things is he talks about development of nations not as a GDP thing, because the U.S. really likes to do that. They'll look at GDP and they'll go, that's it, that's the value of your country. And they don't look at things like infant mortality. They don't look at literacy rates. They don't look at quality of healthcare, things like that. So you're told, oh, Cuba's so poor, and meanwhile you have 99% literacy in the best, healthcare system in the world. So it's hard to decouple a lot of, there's a whole school of economists who, try to give this idea out that GDP is the big thing, and industry should, boom, and it's good when the 1% have a lot of money. Other myths, because I don't know. I don't know why they did it. Maybe they're making a lot of money or something. You ever think about, how, there's a quote from this book song. Someone says, I'm wondering why can't everybody just say the obvious thing and turn to each other and say it, you are my brother, you are my sister, you are my sibling. And we just don't do that.
No, and then that makes me think about if you are an organization and you want to become a whistleblower because you know that they're just up to no good, are there adequate protections to protect the whistleblower? I would argue that there are absolutely not. I mean,
you get to do that once, and I'm
You get
speaking
once.
from experience.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't get the whistle blow twice.
Be
Word gets
blacklisted.
around.
You're blacklisted. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I don't know if there is a list, but I know that you only get away with it once.
And that's awful because you did the right thing.
Yeah.
So society as a
Yeah.
whole benefited, but they're also harming you with the same thing.
Yeah.
It's awful.
First bird that jumps up out of the fields that gets shot, not the rest of them.
Yes, the early bird gets the disease.
The early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese.
The cheese stands alone. Speaking of Cuba, the news likes to talk about how poor they are, but they never